Hello. I've been having some socialist thoughts, some socialist thinking. The way I see it, socialists are enamored by a desire, like a view of the world where you can make everything equitable, fair, nice, and free of unnecessary constraints that they seem to resent, that originate in the system that we already have. And they, they're enamored by a kind of harmony, that they want to embed within the system that we're in. And I would like to say that I am just as enamored by that idea in principle. I think it's, yes, that is the whole point. I think in practice the situation is much more complicated. Now, I've been sort of staunchly anti-capitalist in, a lot of videos before. I think now my position on that is simply much more based on uncertainty rather than... it's still sort of anti-capitalist in spirit, but it's not anti-capitalist in practice. In terms of practice, things get way more complicated, as well as what you actually mean by things like socialism. For instance, if, socialism is in practice related to sort of Soviet-style socialism, then that's not going to work. We know from evidence that that's not going to work. It didn't work for those states, and not just because of dictatorial, imperialistic practices, but because of inherent features of the economy that they had. You could look at the institutions in those economies didn't have hard budget constraints, right? The difference being in capitalism they did, which is why they didn't overuse resources. Which is why Soviet institutions were just chock full of shortages across the board. Everything was in shortage. There was even a labor shortage, even though that it was full employment somehow. So yeah, you get the sense. I also want to emphasize something that, and I haven't done one of these videos in a while, but the whole, right-left spectrum, at least as it's, presented, you ask someone, which side of the thing do you fall on? Are you fiscally conservative? Are you libertarian? What's this? I think the whole spectrum itself is misleading. That entire graph is the result of, it's a social construct in a way. It's simply the result of the kind of political environment that we're in, rather than an inherent sort of embedded truth of the way societies can be organized. Don't think that graph represents the kind of worlds that are possible. The kind of worlds that are possible is way more open than just what's in that graph. In a sense, that graph simply shows you where exactly we should be trying to go, or where exactly one might try to go. If you're, somewhere in that green square, then that just means, well, you really want to go to the left, or libertarian left. So that's the way I see it. But yeah, the reason I'm making this video, in general, I'm going to talk about socialism, is I think it's I find it very unconvincing from most of the arguments that are being made about this topic, both from the socialists themselves and from the right, that they have sort of a practical understanding of what's going on. Both sides seem either very dogmatic or thoughtless in both cases. For instance, a good example of this, and then I'm going to bring up conversations I've witnessed on Twitter. By the way, I have a Twitter now. Please follow me. Yeah, it should be entertaining, but yeah, I used to hate Twitter, but now I don't. Anyway, it's a whole thing. And I've been just followowing some of these leftist YouTubers on Twitter and paying attention to what they've said, and there's just been so many ridiculous arguments. For one, I had some argument with a person who they were making the claim that no matter what, kings, lords, and presidents are all bad because they lord over me. And it's okay, but there's a difference between a president and a king. A very important one, which means you can't just you can, in principle, say that, yeah, there's a hierarchy there, and that doesn't feel good to you, okay, but the hierarchy, at least in the present time, serves a functional purpose. Maybe 1,000 years down the line it won't be necessary anymore, but right now it is. So you can't just take action to try and get rid of that. That's just not going to work. Another argument was people were saying that, like, someone was saying that, like, the whole thing with veganism and how you have, how you have the whole, like, meat industry is super embedded in society right now. You're never going to get rid of that under capitalism. You need socialism to ultimately solve the vegan problem. And I'm just like, no, you don't. No, you don't. You don't need socialism at all to solve the vegan problem. You just need capitalism to innovate and create cultured meat, and then the problem goes away. In fact, the problem will definitely go away whilst we're still under capitalism. It's not going to... It's going to go away in like the next 10 years. We would have probably already had cultured meat on shelves if, the government funded this stuff more. But that's sort of the point, is there's a real sense of dogma is what I'm trying to say. And that kind of dogma is scary, because if you're sort of pushing progress too fast, you'll end up attacking the tools rather than how they're actually used. And the way they should actually be used is we're using the tools to sort of optimize and develop an infrastructure that would allow for society to be as equitable as possible for as long as possible. That's my, like, complexity-driven vision of this. The way I see it is what we're ultimately looking for is for keeping the system alive as long as possible into the future, whilst constantly having it sort of grow and expand and become bigger for as long as possible, and a constant increase in living standards, I guess, or welfare, or happiness, if you will, through that process, which constantly means creating an infrastructure, improving it, and so on and so forth. And I think what that entails practically is that a lot of the things that we're having to rely on now, we simply won't have to rely on in the future. Like in the past, we had to rely on kings and queens. We don't have to rely on them anymore. They still exist. We just don't really, they're just an option now. And if we want, we can, look at them in like video games or film or whatever, or we can pretend to be kings and queens ourselves. We don't have to live in a world constrained by that kind of hierarchy, though. It's still an option. It's just not the only option. Functionally, we've gone beyond that. We still have trade. But for instance, with free healthcare, you don't have to rely on having to compete for resources to be able to afford healthcare. That becomes, an option. Or again, that becomes something that you just get. But in theory, you could still find some weird procedure that you want that you could buy. Or a hunting and gathering is a good example. We don't have to rely on that. You could still go hunt animals out in the wild if you want, but you don't have to rely on that. So on and so forth. And it keeps moving forward like this. And the whole thing is that all the processes that are, at one point we had to rely on them, simply become transferred and conserved in some sort of meta-informational state. They become part of the art or the film or, the recreation that we do. Another example of this I just thought of, in Back to the Future 3, there's a whole scene where the Doc, I forget his name, the Christopher Lloyd's character, he walks into one of the bars and he's talking to these people from like the 1800s, these cowboys, and he's telling them in the future, people run for fun, because people don't run because they have vehicles. And then the guys ask him, he's like, well, do people run at all? It's like, yeah, they run for fun. And they're like, that's ridiculous. Who runs for fun? And yet people still run for fun today. And that's sort of the point. It becomes transferred into the future. It turns into a recreational thing. So working for a wage might turn into a recreational thing in the same sense. It becomes something that is practiced in video games, or even in real life. It doesn't really matter. Again, basic income would do a lot of this. You won't have to work for a wage, but you can if you want. And the same thing with like sort of service sector work, people working in restaurants and stuff, that isn't something you'll have to do. You'll be able to do that for recreation. You won't have to go to a restaurant to get food, or even go to a store. You'll just hit a button on your wall and, steak dinner comes out, vis-a-vis Star Trek. But if you want to go and have the whole dining experience, you can go do that too. And if you're enamored by some, nostalgia from the past, this is how it should work. But the practice of what we're doing, my point is the practical side of what we're doing today, that is very tricky. Simply pushing it, pushing this whole, using this whole idea of progress to push something very specific could be very destructive, is what I'm saying. And that is what socialism was in the past, and it could easily still be that in the future. So there's a little bit of a critique there. It could still be that today, and these are examples of what I said. If you want to start, to make some sort of authoritarian law to prevent people from trying to make a profit because you think that is the path of progress, you might be doing it wrong. That kind of thing, for it to work, it has to be part of like a gradual evolutionary process. So you can't just force it. But then again, that doesn't mean you don't force anything. There are certain things that do have to be forced, and a lot of them have to do with just changing our understanding of the thing. I recently finished reading Steve Keen's new book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And that sort of confirms like a lot of what's holding back politics today and economics is simply the fact that people don't understand the way money works. We have a completely wrong idea of what money is. People think money is a veil for barter, or rather it's a veil for wealth itself, which it's not. If you want to see capitalism as a process of increasing everybody's wealth, that's perfectly fine. That makes sense. But increasing everybody's money is not the same thing. And so we have a distorted view of what money is, and a lot of problems result just from that. And you have to fix that, and part of fixing that involves reforming economics itself. So you don't have to necessarily look for revolution. You can just try to reform economics, and reforming economics could eventually reform political systems and improve everything that way. The revolution sounds, it sounds great. I don't want to be a part of it. I'd be fine to just witness it. I think it would be cool to sort of be in the middle of history that way. But yeah, you don't have to go that way. There are smarter ways to go about it, which is something, is definitely something worth respecting. There's something else I wanted to mention about that whole money-driven thing. I forget what it is. Anyway. So yeah, this is sort of the theory we're going about. I also just have a weird annoyance thing with what this is in general the problem with the left. At least on YouTube, let's call it the stupid left, but they have a dogmatic approach to all this. And I think the writers, the authors, the leftists that are actually develop the ideas themselves are smarter in that they don't have a dogmatic approach. They're this is more of, David Graeber, for instance, he has a whole thing where he's anarchism is a state of mind, a general attitude, not a specific thing we're trying to create. That makes more sense to me than anarchism is a specific thing that we're trying to create. Because remember, hierarchies, you want to be against hierarchies, but hierarchies are also functional. They're not just there to oppress you. They have a functional purpose as well as a distorted, value-distorting purpose. So you have to distinguish between the two and try to keep the functional thing whilst getting rid of the excess. And that's, that could be complicated. I was going to make a video recently about anarcho-communism, but the interesting thing about the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, they had a thing where they allowed workers to vote for their bosses. Bosses would be, because I think before people were appointed based on some, analysis that those guys did. But then they allowed people to vote for their bosses, and this was, at least in the place where my mother worked, was a huge disaster. A guy ran sort of a populist campaign. He was very popular, but then he got into his position, and he was a total disaster. He was a maniac. He didn't know what he was doing. He was completely incompetent. and he ran everything into the ground. So those, you could use that as an argument against democracy in general, but there is a way in which democracy, there are ways where democracy doesn't work. So, like, again, everything has to just be sort of balanced, meritocratically as well as democratically, because, yeah, sometimes, democratic process is more meritocratic as a selection process for sort of the right way things work. I was actually thinking, I have a lot of time at work to just think about these things now. I was thinking probably a very good way for the socialist idea of workers owning the means of production is to just give every single worker some profit share. Getting rid of wage labor completely, replacing it with like basic income and profit shares, because most work isn't factory work anymore. Factory work is being replaced with machines. Most of the work people do is service kind, it's either service kind of work or it's very it's computer, driven work. It's programming. It's the kind of work where you're not actually working all the time. You're not just sitting there doing the same thing on an assembly line or whatever. You're not. It's not procedure. It's not the kind of thing where it makes sense to have an hourly wage. And companies are actually realizing this, and so it's sort of coming to light. Oh, and that actually brings me up to another thing. A lot of these like socialist ideals are things that companies themselves are coming up with, like office plans where without cubicles and just flat corporate structures, and making everything more equitable, making everything more, sort of nice and liberal, and you can wear whatever you want to work, and you have all these, like, team building things and whatever. And the point is there's all these, like, efforts being made within the market itself to make things better for the workers. Now, you could say that it's not enough, and I probably agree, because there's a lot of low-wage workers where that are probably being screwed over. But the point is, it's not like it's not like there's an inherent evil in the system, is what I'm trying to say. You also have to keep in mind the whole Hayekian point about how the system works whilst most of us know very little about how it actually works. And this is actually crucial, because if this is something that survives all the way into the future, this is minus... The only way that this would change is if we introduce a collective consciousness or a mega-consciousness thing, which I've talked about in other videos. But the Hayekian thing where the system works without us knowing how it works, whilst most people in the system know very little about what all the other people are doing. Like, I know about what I'm doing, and maybe a handful of other people a little bit, but I know very little beyond that. That is like a very inherent thing, and a lot of the reasons capitalism exists and has existed for so long and has worked the way it does is because of that, because it's a system that is sort of locally enforceable. Individuals only know their own local information and act based on that, and that is actually an aspect of human nature that's way more fundamental than the kind of greed that the right wing preaches about all the time. They talk about, like, capitalism is natural because of greed. No, it's natural because of information constraints, which I don't see the left talking about too much. Any alternate system will have to also feature this, the kind of constraints where everything is locally enforceable. So you have to think about that as well. And that makes things a bit more complicated. Again, you can avoid that by introducing a mega consciousness, and it could be, eventually, like 1,000 years later, that's what we're going to have, is a kind of mega consciousness where, literally there won't be any sort of, it won't be locally enforceable, because it'll all just be one giant organism. But, short of us doing something like that, I think, as the process goes along, we're going to have to deal with local enforceability. And one thing that drives the kind of, processes of nationalizing certain goods is more people living in cities and the sort of general interactivity level increasing in society, whilst it's still being locally enforceable. If you may not know what all the other people are doing, but the fact that you all live in a city, you can see a lot of, like, macro, economic, macroscopic patterns that emerge as a result of that. And that gives you a sense of what everybody wants, and all of your interests become entangled, and then it becomes a process of, okay, well then we should just nationalize and the sewage system or whatever, because we all benefit from that the same way, and we should nationalize the food production system, because that's something that we can do, which, by the way, is probably going to happen. I mean, with the way automation's working, the production of like basic consumer goods could be nationalized. It wouldn't be that difficult. It's just a matter of creating the infrastructure and figuring out the rules to make the whole thing work, to integrate it with like the commons. Another problem I have with all this with this kind of thinking, though, is that it sort of justifies the existence of capitalism in the past, which it annoys me, because it's sort of justifying like the suffering that happened under capitalism, and basically saying that, yeah, that suffering had to happen for us to get here. It's like all of that suffering had to happen, for us to have a better world today. And on the one hand, that appeals to me, because at like an individual level, it appeals to me. The idea of like self-sacrifice, I'm enamored by that concept, and I think it's like, yeah, if I have to suffer today so that people are happy years in the future, that's fine. That's great. I'm willing to do that. But the difference here is that here we're making people do that, making lots of people do that, justifying the history of capitalism, basically without them necessarily having the internal drive to do that themselves. And that doesn't seem very fair. The rejoinder, at least in theory, is that the way capitalism emerged isn't the way things had to happen. It was simply the most likely way for things to have happened. Because, again, what was driving it is the limit of information. It's that we didn't know how to make the system perfect from the beginning, I guess, or how to make the system good. If we knew, or if we had a better sense, if the right ideals sort of evolved, if the right sort of memes evolved, we may not have had the problem. For example, the veganism thing, again. Imagine that there was like some city in the historical past that was completely vegan, and let's say that all the other cities were somehow killed off, and the vegan city thrived, and it emerged into a massive vegan empire. Well, then we would have already had the whole, or not vegan, but like some sort of nice to animal society. And, well, if that thing emerged and stayed that way forever, then we would have had a nice-to-animal society all the way now. It would have happened that way from the beginning. It just happened not to have happened that way because of sort of random variables in the evolutionary process. So, yeah, there's that. Yeah, I guess I'm just sort of rambling about all the different sides of this, but I just, like, I feel like the real issue is so complicated, and the people who discuss it, at least so far, just dumb it down too much. I don't think it's like there's obvious, with Marx himself, there's obvious contributions that Marx made. There's no way that Marx knew everything with this whole thing, that he had a perfectly good idea in mind, that it all makes sense. I hear like workers control the means of production. Well, what that means could be very vague. I don't know what exactly Marx detailed, and if somebody knows, please let me know if there's something specific there, but I doubt that there's a specific sense of what the solution is supposed to look like. I think it's all just sort of vague theories and attitudes, which is fine if you're aware of this as sort of a gradual long-term process, not as something specific that you're trying to achieve in the immediacy. Because if it is, like the labor theory of value is a good example. Labor theory of value is ridiculous. I can't understand why anyone believes in the labor theory of value. Like there's literally, it's more ridiculous than the theories of value on the right. So it's sort of just bizarre that is a thing that Marxists try to cling to. I mean, there's definitely better theories of value out there. Steve Keen's sort of physics-driven theory of value makes way more sense. I'm trying to say that value is something that comes from energy itself, free energy in the world, and labor and capital come in, and land as well come in to sort of affect it in different ways. Not just pure labor theory of value. It's just ridiculous. I'm not going to go into detail, but it is. So yeah, then there's also that. And the other ultimate question here, the other, like, another nuance to this whole thing is what the question of happiness is in general. What sort of quantity or what sort of quality of human existence are we trying to maximize here? Because on the one hand, you can view everything in life as a kind of force that just acts against you and makes you feel unhappy, that you can only alleviate a little bit. I don't agree with that. I think that's ridiculous. But we do need to have a sort of agreed upon sense of what kind of welfare we're trying to create. The way I see it is, and it's not just purely a hedonic view of welfare, the way I see it is human beings have a kind of completionist tendency. We have certain goals that we want to achieve, and we have certain appetites that we want to quench, that we want to satisfy. And the process of satisfying those appetites is perfectly fine. That is the thing that you want. The problem is when all kinds of, like, other bullshit get in the way of that process, or when an appetite goes too long unsatisfied. That's when you get a problem. I'm seeing it, like, at work right now. There's things that I want to do. There are certain struggles that I want to be part of, sort of inherently, intrinsically. There's, like, an intrinsic value motivator thing. There are certain, like, there's certain challenges, like, I see the other end of the road and I want to run to that end of the road. I want to do that. It's not, there's nothing there there's nothing in that that's, like, inherently bad, because the desire comes from within. The problem is, like, oh, I tripped and fell and like, busted my knee. That is the problem. I want to work on this particular thing, but I have to find some job to make a wage, to make ends meet, because of, the system. That is when things become a problem. And there's a time-related issue to this as well. You have to make a decision quickly enough because you need resources within the given system, and you don't have the time necessarily to figure out how it is that you could participate in the system, but with the interest that you actually have. And you would have more time in a system that had things like a basic income, or where we had immortality tech, and people just didn't die, because then you'd have all the time in the world to figure out how it is that you could participate. But yeah, the point is, like, it's not the actual, it's not the idea of struggle itself that's the problem. It's the idea of, like, unwanted struggle coming in and screwing things up for no reason, for no intuitive reason. If a hurricane comes through and screws everything up, yeah, it might be bad, but at least that makes some sense. But if society's making me struggle, that doesn't make intuitive sense. That seems like it's somebody's making me do that, or because of somebody else's interest and stupidity I have to do that. It's not obvious why that is in my interest, or why that is something that I have to do. And it's this whole... And we have a tendency to just rebel against that sort of process. That kind of, like... The kind of society's hammer coming down and making us do things. Because it's not obvious that that's something that is either in our interests, or in other people's or like in other people's interests, but it's not obvious why that's for the better. It's not obvious why that's for the betterment of the system. If you could live, and every single time society made you do something, it was palpable that what it was making you do was for the betterment of the system, and you could feel that would be a different story. But that's not always there. We don't always feel that. And maybe the thing is external, but it could also be internal, and this is where things get complicated. It could just be because a person's own ignorance or delusion that they don't see how participating in a certain process is either in their interests or in the interests of the system, or in a way kind of an inevitable part of the process that they basically have to embrace, that there's no logic to them being against it. That could also be a thing, and age has a certain way of dissolving that kind of rebellious attitude. Not entirely, though, hence why these movements have never gone away, is because there is always a rebelliousness there that survives, because the fact that it's there, I guess proves that there is, in fact, reason to think that the things that society makes us do are not, in fact, always for the betterment. They are not optimized, they are not objects of necessity. I guess that's the difference. Like, if you believe that everything that you have to do is a necessity, that is a coping mechanism where you can just be okay with it then. You know, I hate working for a wage, but if it's a necessity, then I'm not sort of emotionally traumatized by it because I see it as a necessity. It's not great, but it's a necessity. And that kind of necessity-based thinking, you can use it wrong, but it's still useful. And I guess the fact that it's an interesting question if it is in fact possible to have a society where everything that happens feels like a necessity, right? Either something that we want to do, a good thing that we want to do, or a true necessity. It's not obvious whether it's even possible to have a world like that. However, hopefully, it's possible to create a world that feels more like that more often than it does not. And I suppose that's the goal, at least partially. And I don't think it's actually going to happen until we have immortality tech, because immortality tech seems to be like, a big thing that's a big time constraint removal thing. You know, when we have infinite time, it doesn't matter if I have to work for a wage in my 20s or whatever. I'm alive forever, so who the fuck cares? I can do what I can put things off till later. The only thing you can't put off is figuring out how to, make sure that we survive when the sun starts to expand by getting off the planet. But yeah, anyway, you get the idea. So you have to also balance this concept of necessity along with rebelling against the things society sort of makes us do. Some things you can't, in some cases you want to rebel against the things that are being done to you, but the things being done to you have to win because they're inherently justified or something, and that's where necessity comes in. Anyway, that's just rambling thoughts about socialism and the whole socialist process, but yeah, I guess that's it. Let me know what you think. Cheers.